Okay, so this is the third video lecture on the neurobiological chapter. In the last one, I was talking about some brain development, and this one I want to get a little bit more into some of the terminology and how that applies to some of these other things we've talked about. Okay, so we've already talked about the different ways of thinking about the brain structures, and I just said we weren't gonna spend too much time talking about the hindbrain, forebrain, and midbrain, but here we go. Here's a slide where we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But one thing to think about is when we think about brain structures, they're not exactly like puzzle pieces. They're not like things that you can just pull apart out of the brain. But what actually it's more like I'm trying to think of, it's probably more like a rat in your hair, right? Where things become kind of they're intertwined and intertangled. But neurons, brain cells, do create like clusters, and they create these neural pathways. Sometimes, if you ever hear of the phrase of a memory trace, a memory trace is a phenomena where these neurons are fired together over and over again, and they kind of create like a ridge. Actually, another way to think about them might be hair calyx. If you ever have, like, I got these big old ones right here, right? And the hairs all kind of go together. They always grow together. And so they create this, when this happens in the brain, you can think of it like a neural pathway. And so these brain structures are made up of all of these clusters of neurons that kind of work together. Now, it doesn't mean there's not structures. There certainly are, but it's not like a puzzle piece that you can easily just pluck it out, right? So some of the structures, when we think about the hindbrain, what some of the structures that you might find there, and you'll know this is like the third part if you think about the way it develops, is the cerebellum. This is the bell at the bottom of your brain. I always think about if I was to write a zombie movie, this would be the part of the brain that, yeah, I think you would have to, so this that you would need to poke, that you need to stab in order to kill a zombie. But the cerebellum is actually quite accessible, and it's kind of fragile because it's at the base of the skull. And you could potentially like come up under into the cerebellum. I feel kind of a connection to the cerebellum because my father actually died of a brain tumor, and it was in his cerebellum. And because this is such a central, so it's so pivotal to our survival, because again, this is swallowing and breathing. I remember they couldn't operate, and I remember being in the elevator, and my father had decided he wasn't going to seek treatment, and the neurologist said, "Well, the problem will be when he can't swallow anymore." And I remember saying to them, "So then what do you do?" And she's like, "Right." So the cerebellum regulate balance. This is also the part of the brain that alcohol will affect. So because it is implicated in breathing and balance, right? You see a drunk person loses their balance because it slowed down their cerebellum. Eventually, a person who's so drunk can actually stop breathing because it slows down the mechanisms of their brain that enables them to breathe, right? The midbrain structures, we'll talk a little bit more about that. The midbrain structures are implicated in vision and auditory processing. They're sort of in the middle. The auditory processing actually goes through another structure before it is interpreted by the cortex. And the same thing with our visual processing. So we have our eyes that actually register the image, that actually like see the colors, but it's our higher functioning that interpret what all that means. Oh, and then there you go. And then you got your forebrain, right? That's the first part of the neural tube, and this is all the folds in our brain. When we think about brain, we think about this what we call the cortex, or the cerebral cortex. Also, that's considered part of the forebrain is your limbic system, and I'll talk quite a bit about the limbic system, and it's actually my favorite part of the brain to talk about. And then the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is of course what runs down your spine, right? It's a soft tube. It's got all these little nerves that come out like this that connect to all the other things, and so it is sort of, well, it might be, I don't know, how would you describe it, or what word might we think of it? It's all the signals that come into one central location, and it goes up to the higher functioning structure for interpretation, and then the higher structure of the brain has to send it back down. Talk more about that in a minute. Okay. Oh, here's another fun slide. I must have stuck it in here during election season, but there was actually some research done on people people who identify with certain political affiliations and where they see more activity in the brain. And I'm not going to go into any politics necessarily, but there was enough of a difference for a scientist to write a paper about it. And what they found is that certain people who identified with one political philosophy, like they put you in these machines that process blood flow to certain regions of the brain. This region of the brain, the anterior, oh my gosh, cingulate cortex, is active when we think about other people. This structure is the amygdala, and I'll talk again about the amygdala. I'm not sure why it is in this order here, but the amygdala is a part of the brain that interprets fear and anger. And what they found was that people who identified as one political campaign or one side of the political aisle had more activity in the brain structures that were active when people thought about others. And another group had more activity in the part of the brain that was implicated during fear and anger. And I'm just going to leave it at that and let you sort of speculate as to which side those would be. Okay, so 4 brain structures, the structures that are at the front end of, now here you go, here's a good picture of those folds, right, of the cortex, the cerebral cortex. This image is illustrating the connecting tissue, and that is the corpus callosum. Right here is the word, and these are the neurons that connect the right and the left. Interestingly enough, and this I believe is a quiz question, is that these connections can actually be severed between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. We'll talk a bit in a second about how those hemispheres are different. They're basically mirrors of themselves, but the corpus callosum allows for the information from the right side to be communicated with the left side and vice versa. But you can actually live with this being severed. And once upon a time, people who had epileptic seizures would undergo severing of the corpus callosum to stop those seizures because it slows down the neurological firing. An interesting thing I learned, which probably is not really related to this, but it speaks to how our nervous system is right versus left, and how there is like a dividing line, is if you've what's it called? Shingles, which is a virus caused by, it's like a commercial. It's a virus caused by chickenpox. It actually only affects one side of the body. So one of the ways it's diagnosed is if you have pain or a blistering, it'll only be on one side of the body. It won't cross the midline. And that's one of the ways they can diagnose what shingles is. Okay, the brain then is also divided up into lobes, sort of like geographical regions. Those 4 lobes are the frontal lobe, right? So this is I don't have a good picture. The frontal lobe, which would sort of be up here, that plans. I always think about it, it's the forehead, it plans ahead, right? The temporal lobe, your temples, right? As you might think about that, really close to your ear. So the temporal lobe is implicated in our hearing. Our occipital, or I get these words sometimes confused, which looks an awful lot like optical. Believe it or not, it's actually on the back, right? So what your vision centers is the light, the image is projected through the optical nerve, and it actually is projected way to the back. If any of you are old enough to remember pinhole cameras from like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, where the image was actually projected on the back of the camera. And then there's a parietal lobe, which actually is a little bit more like a strip. It's like a strip of sensory processing that both receives sensory information like touch, heat, things, and then it sends the messages back. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one in another slide too. Okay, coming up on my 10 minutes here, so I'm going to stop right here.